going on, FIA family? My name is Javier Barraza, and welcome to Raising the Bar podcast. Today, we'll be talking to Jessica Sliwerski. She is an educator, early literacy coach, CEO, and co-founder of Ignite Reading. In this podcast, we cover her upbringing, educational background, and her Ignite programming that's happening nationwide. Hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Jessica, to Raise the Bar podcast. We're super excited to have you here this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Javier. I am so excited to be here. This is my first podcast I've done that is like with someone who is all about Oakland, and I am also a community member of Oakland, and so excited to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for being here. We're just excited to have you join us. And I think first, let's just start off with having you introduce who you are, right? And then also, how long have you been in your role?
Yeah, so I am Jessica Sliwerski. I'm CEO and co-founder of Ignite Reading. And the question of how long I have been in my role is a highly nuanced question. So I would say quite literally, Ignite Reading has been its own standalone company since fall of 2021.
Got you.
But the backstory of Ignite Reading, which is deeply rooted in Oakland and specifically in East Oakland, puts us back to winter of 2019.
Nice. And what got you? Well, first, before we even get into Ignite Reading, tell me a little bit more about your background, and even before Ignite Reading, what got you to that point, right?
Mm-hmm. So I am an educator. I think of myself even now as CEO of Ignite Reading, and for the past several years, I've been a CEO of something. But in my heart, I am an educator and very much still someone who identifies as a teacher. And about 20 years ago, when I was in my senior year at UCLA, I was sitting in a poli-sci class, and in my mind, Javier, I thought that I was going to go to law school after I graduated. I was very inspired by Legally Blonde, as you can probably tell from everything about how I show up. And a recruiter for Teach for America came into my poli-sci class and started talking about this program, and I was really intrigued. I come from a family of educators, and I, throughout high school and college, volunteered in classrooms and really, really enjoyed teaching kids. And so when I heard about this thing called Teach for America, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I could take 2 years and go and teach somewhere and then go to law school. And so I applied on a whim. I was accepted into their New York City program. I had never even visited New York City, but I was like, sure, why not? This seems like a great opportunity. And went to New York City, started teaching in the Bronx. And within my very first week of my first year of teaching, I just knew. I was like, this is it. This is what I want to do. I want to be an educator. And the thing that especially influenced this decision was that I showed up in my classroom, and it was immediately apparent to me how ill prepared I was to teach the kids in front of me who were fifth grade students. And very quickly, what I learned in that first week was that a lot of my kids still didn't know how to read. And I was just floored. We white people didn't talk about privilege back then in the way that it's now a more open discussion and conversation. And so I didn't quite have the vocabulary, but what I understood was that the public education I had experienced simply through the birth lottery was not the public education that my kids in the Bronx were experiencing. And that wasn't okay. All kids, every single child deserves to have the highest quality educational experience. And it was just so obvious to me right out of the gate that that was not happening. And that was the beginning of me beginning to understand that there are deep inequities in public education in our country. And I was really not okay with that, and had no idea how I would fix it or help fix it. I just knew that it was wrong, and that I was going to commit my career to being an educator and trying to figure out how to make it better. And then over the course of the next couple of years, found that literacy was my niche, and the thing that I was most passionate about, and that I felt so strongly that learning to read and the right to learn to read was so core to unlocking so much inequity in education and ensuring that every child has the opportunity to access everything that school and life can promise.
Right. And I have a couple of follow-up questions for you as well. So one, just thank you for sharing that because that was super insightful. And I feel like I know a lot more about where you're coming from, right? So I'm curious. So you started in the Bronx. At what time did you make your way out here to the East Bay?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I'm just going to tell you everything about my life
Like,
story.
that's a whole other story.
Private person, and that is a loaded question. Okay, so born and raised in the Bay Area,
Got you.
went to UCLA for undergrad, went to New York City to begin my teaching career. Um, I spent 11 years in New York City, and during that time, I was a classroom teacher, I was a school leader, I was an instructional coach, K through 12. I was coaching principals across New York City around best practices in literacy instruction, and then accidentally co-founded my first ed tech company with a literacy app that I designed. And meanwhile, also got married and had a baby. And right after my daughter was born, I was unexpectedly diagnosed with breast cancer.
Mm.
And so I embarked upon treatment in New York City. But as I, came out of treatment, you go through an experience like this, and it puts a lot of things in perspective. And
Right.
so I realized that I really needed and wanted to be closer to family. I also just had like so much trauma as a result of the cancer experience that I felt like I needed a fresh start, and just a little bit of a different lifestyle, which California can offer with better weather and just a slightly
Right.
slower pace of life. And so we relocated back to the Bay Area, and our daughter was 1 at the time. We landed in San Francisco for 1 year, and I was just like, I can't live in this fog. And so as we started figuring out where we were going to like really settle down, we landed in Oakland because you get way more sunshine in Oakland.
Right.
And fast forward a little bit more, I have since gotten divorced, but am still very much here in Oakland, and no imminent plans to ever leave Oakland. I really, really love it here. It's a great community. And my daughter, who's now 9, loves to talk about how much she loves Oakland. And I think it's a really great experience to grow up in such a like rich, diverse community.
Right. Right. Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a lot of issues in Oakland, right? But when it comes down to it, and I was actually just having a conversation about this, but it's like Oakland is so beautiful, right? There's so much beauty to the city of Oakland, and sometimes there's a lot of stuff going on within it, right? But we can't just lose picture of what the potential of this city is, right, and how diverse it is as well. But I do want to go back to thank you for sharing all that.
Yeah.
So you were really involved as an educator a lot. What were some of the best practices that you would share to principals
Mhm.
about early literacy? Like, how would you work with these principals? Because you even said like when you first started, you were ill prepared, right? Like, what is some of that practice that goes on with principals and also just with other educators that you've like been able to share with them?
Oh, such a great question. When I was coaching principals, this was in New York City. This was over 10 years ago. And every school that I was working with was very deep in balanced literacy and implementing the Lucy Calkins curriculum, which we know is deeply problematic in light of all of the journalism that Emily Hanford has done, and films like the Right to Read film. And even then, I remember working with principals and doing classroom observations or curriculum audits. And the thing that I would say to them was, okay, so you're implementing this curriculum, which has your teachers leading these really rich, surface level, beautiful lessons, but nobody's teaching your kids to read. And
Mm-hmm.
when you look at your data shows that your kids are not proficient readers. And the reason that they're not proficient readers is because they have not cracked the code. And in order to ensure that they become explicit readers, you need to adopt and implement a curriculum that is going to actually teach them how to read. And I was really lucky that my journey in education was such that in my third year of teaching, when I went and I started working at a high performing charter school in New York City, it
Mm-hmm.
just so happened that this charter school was using an evidence based curriculum that was rooted in what we now call the science of reading.
Got
And
you.
so, very early in my career as a first grade teacher, I learned how to teach kids to read. And I remember acutely because it was my third year of teaching. I was now teaching first graders. My previous 2 years of teaching, I'd been teaching fifth graders, many of whom couldn't read. I was like running myself ragged, trying to figure out how to teach them to read. Never could figure it out because everyone I asked just kept handing me things like Fountas and Pinnell saying, use this, which is not how you teach kids to read. We now know.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like so eye-opening as a first grade teacher to be given a curriculum that actually taught my kids to read and to have the experience of teaching them to read. And I remember thinking, yes, this is a science and it is not rocket science. And
Mm-hmm.
how lucky am I that I've learned to do this, but then very quickly realizing that so many teachers across New York City were not doing this. And I was early in my career, so I didn't have a national lens just yet,
Right.
but I knew something was wrong. And I knew that I was really lucky because I was being empowered to actually teach my kids to read. So then, as I started coaching principals and I was doing these curriculum audits with them as part of like really helping them strengthen their literacy ecosystems, I was always pointing out to them, you aren't actually teaching kids to read. And so, if you want your third grade test scores to be better, your kids need to be able to actually read the test that is put in front of them.
And what was that? What was that reaction like? Because I mean, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I'm just curious. Like, what was that reaction from principals when you would tell them that? Tell them that,
You know, I think that nobody likes to hear that they're
right?
not doing a good job.
Right.
And I think I somehow do a really good job of being really charming, even while telling people shit that they don't want to hear. Now, it
Right.
doesn't always work. I have made plenty of enemies along the way, or people who don't like me because I am so unapologetic about speaking truth to power on behalf of kids. But I think even those people who don't want to hear it and don't like hearing it, like deep down, they know that I'm right. And whether they're going to listen right away or listen later on, eventually they have to listen. And I think that through the way that I would show up, the way that I would build trust, the way that, I would first pick other things where they could experience quick, small wins to further build trust before I then dropped the bomb of, you are not teaching your kids to read. This is not okay. This is what you need to do curriculum wise if you're going to ultimately boost your third grade test scores. They had to listen, and they were more inclined to listen because I'd shown in other ways that I knew what I was talking about. But that is not an easy pill to swallow. It's not. And particularly in the balanced literacy world, or like the cult of Lucy Calkins and everybody who was drinking that Kool-Aid back then, it was like I was like blowing their minds with what I was telling them. But I was also able to point to proof points around, like, here are the places where they are teaching this way, and look at the outcomes they're getting. And oh, by the way, I'm not telling you to do something that I haven't personally done myself and gotten exceptional outcomes for kids. So don't sit here and tell me that, you know, your kids don't need this, or that, like, oh, well, you know, it's not my problem as a school leader. It's because of the parents, or it's because they're multilingual learners, or it's because they're poor. Like, none of that is true, because I have actually taught classrooms that were entirely Black and brown children, and they have learned to read at exceptionally high levels. So the issue is not the kids. The issue is that you are not providing access to the instruction that they need in order to ensure that they learn to read. And I think that while that was hard to hear, I also kind of didn't care. Right? Like, I wasn't there to be anybody's best friend. I was there to help them get outcomes for kids. And the principals who listened, who then made the moves to adopt evidence-based curriculums and roll out those curricula with their teacher and invest in the training of their teachers, they then started seeing the outcomes in terms of their kids learning to read. And then as their kids matriculated into third grade, their kids then passing those high stakes reading comprehension tests.
Nice. And I have one more question before we get into, Ignite Reading. But here at FIA, we're really about parent and student agency, right? I specifically work with students in high school, but when it comes to parents, we also want parents to be informed about this information, right? When it comes to early literacy practices, right? Is there any like message or any advice you would want to give parents who might even watch this about just how to better support their child, or how to better be involved in their child's education around early literacy?
Oh, wow. Yes. Let me share a number of things that pop into my mind, particularly as a parent. The number one thing I will say is trust your gut. And what I mean by that is that as parents, I think we have this sort of like sixth sense around things, and you can just kind of like feel when something isn't quite right with your child. And so as it comes to learning to read, if something feels not right, if it feels like your child is not learning something that you think they should be learning, or you're listening to them read and they're showing that they're not reading fluently, and that worries you, don't disregard that voice. Like that gut instinct is real. And as difficult as it may be, like, go and have the conversation with the teacher and with the school. And if you aren't satisfied with the answers that you are getting, then fight like hell to advocate for your baby. Because if there is one thing that we should be doing above all else in public education, it is making sure every child learns to read. And some schools, sadly, are doing this much better than other schools. And therefore, parents have to be ready to lean in and have to be ready to fight, not just for their own babies, but for all of the other babies in that school whose parents, for whatever reason, might not be able to advocate for them.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah, and I would love to just hear a little bit more about like your inspiration for Ignite Reading and just to hear a little bit about the work that you guys do here in Oakland.
So I alluded earlier in the conversation about how like the story of Ignite Reading is rooted in Oakland, and like technically this goes back to 2019.
Right.
And I've talked, even just your question about like, what advice do you have for parents? That is actually grounded in the real life story of Ignite Reading here in Oakland. So there is a documentary film called The Right to Read Film, and it tells the story of a really wonderful teacher, Sabrina Causey. She teaches first grade at Markham Elementary School in East Oakland. And fun fact, I'm also in the Right to Read film. I am the person who taught Sabrina Causey to teach her kids to read and was also working in her classroom. But the backstory here is that I was also a parent of a child in public school in Oakland who was really, really, really mad because that school wasn't teaching kids to read. And when I was advocating not just for my child, but also for all of the kids in that school to be getting a structured literacy approach to reading, was essentially told to just like shut up and go away. And I had been volunteering at the school. I was kicked out of volunteering at my daughter's school. And so I reached out to the office that places volunteers in Oakland schools and said, I know how to teach kids to read. I want to help. Can you please place me in a school where they want help? And they ended up placing me at Markham. And if you think about it, I'm sure you know some things about Markham given your work in East Oakland. At the time that I started volunteering there, right before the pandemic, literacy proficiency was only 2%. And so they placed me at a place where it was like, you know what, things are so bad at this school. Like, go ahead, go ahead, troublemaker, go over there, because now you're like out of everybody's hair and nobody cares.
They were testing you. That's what they were doing.
Oh yeah, they were completely testing me. And I was like, okay, put me wherever you want, because I know how to teach kids to read and I know what's possible when kids start learning to read, and was pretty fearless and bullish about it. And I started working with Sabrina Causey, and we were teaching her kids to read. And in a very short amount of time, they were making really phenomenal progress learning to read. And the trajectory that her babies were on was such that her first graders would have ended first grade reading on grade level. And in a school that had, at the time, only 2% literacy proficiency, that is a really big deal. And what a proof point like that shows is that nothing is wrong with the kids. The problem is the system and kids not being given access to what they need in order to learn to read. And so we were teaching the kids to read, and then school shut down. And I remember Sabrina and I packing up their backpacks and sending them home with a bunch of books and word lists to practice and instructions for their parents, because we were like, okay, you're going to have this extended spring break because of this virus. It's really important you stay on top of these skills that we're working on so that when you come back, we can just like hit the ground running and not miss a beat. And then they never came back.
Yeah.
And I get really attached to people, and I couldn't stop thinking about the kids that we'd been working with and how we were on this path to end the school year with them reading on grade level, which, like, Javier, that is literally life changing, right?
Yeah.
To learn to read on time and what that means for your school opportunities and your life opportunities. And I couldn't stop thinking about them. And then meanwhile, the world is switching to Zoom school, and I have my own child who at the time was in pre-K, and I'm watching what's happening as she's on Zoom, and I'm just like, in my head, I'm like, this is such a waste of time, and there is something about this. There is something to this. And so as Sabrina and I were talking about how she could transition her instruction to this virtual modality, she made this comment as we were heading into fall of 2020, where
Mhm.
she said, hey, everything's going to be on Zoom at the beginning of this school year. And, my principal said I can teach whatever I want. And I was like, no, you are not going to teach whatever you want. We're going to do what we were doing, and we're going to adapt it to Zoom. And
Mhm.
my theory of action, I believed that we could adapt it and that we could still teach her kids to read. So we get to work doing this. She starts teaching. She does her baseline diagnostics. She starts grouping the kids based on skills. She's meeting with them in breakout rooms. She is teaching them to read virtually. And within the first month of teaching this way, she has her first crop of data, and we're looking at it, and lo and behold, her kids are learning to read. And
So, what percentage of those students were at grade level
none,
beforehand?
none of them. They were starting first grade already well below grade
Oh.
level, with kindergarten gaps that she needed to close, and then as
Mm.
quickly as possible start getting into first grade content.
So they were moving towards.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize this. They don't realize that as early as first grade, these gaps exist. But the beauty of first grade is so magical, is that if you are intentional and you are using programs that work and you are urgent, like, you can close those kindergarten gaps and cover those first grade skills, and your babies can leave first grade readers ready to start second grade fluently reading and building knowledge. And that was like, I was watching as she was teaching on Zoom, and this data's coming in and it was working. And I vividly remember emailing Kareem Weaver, Kareem,
Yeah.
and being like, I think we're onto something here. There is a model here.
Mhm.
And then what I started obsessing about was, how do I clone Sabrina Kazi? How do I build a national core of reading instructors who are teaching kids to read virtually? And not in small groups like Sabrina was doing, but instead one-on-one,
Mhm.
because I knew that if it could be one-on-one, it could be even more precise and it could be even more accelerated. And so that was when I coincidentally met my co-founder, and we started envisioning this concept of Ignite Reading. And the idea was, how do we bring into classrooms, through leveraging technology, highly trained reading instructors who can meet one-on-one with kids and give this targeted intervention in a way that honors and respects that classroom teachers, it is simply impossible for them to differentiate to the needs of every single child. And yet that is what must happen if we're going to ensure every child learns to read. And I wanted this to be like a deeply supportive model where classroom teachers felt like they had, as many as 20 plus other highly trained instructors virtually coming into their classroom and helping them ensure that all of their kids would learn to read.
Mm-hmm. And you're kind of going a little bit into this already, right? But and one, that's awesome. I think it's amazing where it came from, and it just makes sense. And I'm curious to know a little bit more about like what have you guys seen as success so far? But I think this kind of goes into the next question I'm asking already. So one thing that we love asking during this podcast is how are you currently raising the bar? Right. So I would love to hear about how are you currently raising the bar here in Oakland, right? Hopefully you can share a little bit, but also just nationwide, right? Like I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
And it can be through yourself and also like just the work that you're doing with Ignite Reading.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in terms of the success that we've seen in the program, this program's kind of taken off like wildfire because the need is so great nationally, and we had our very first school-based pilot in the fall of 2021 when schools were, kids were coming back after a year of Zoom school.
Mm-hmm.
And they were presenting with huge gaps. And our very first pilot was also in Oakland. So again, this like deep roots in Oakland. And since then, over the course of these last 3 school years, we have scaled to serve over 15,000 kids nationally, spanning 14 states. And my vision is as quickly as possible without diminishing the quality of what we're doing. I want to be teaching millions of kids a day to read. And I really hope that what our model can do is galvanize and catalyze school systems. We're trying to build capacity because it takes a village if we want to ensure that all kids learn to read and ideally learn to read before they start second grade. So when I think about how we are raising the bar, on the one hand, when I think about our story in Oakland and going back in time to when I was a parent who was pretty angry, angry not just because my child wasn't being taught, but more angry because all the other kids weren't being taught.
Mm-hmm.
With my background as an educator, I knew how to teach my child to read, but in me teaching her to read because her school wasn't, I was playing into the shadow system in education where the parents who have means hire tutors to make sure their kids learn to read, right? And so I was like, this is not okay, right? I'm doing what I need to do as a parent to make sure my child will be okay. But I also have the perspective and the knowledge around what needs to happen in order for other kids to also be okay. And when I was shut down, I didn't give up. And in fact, like I look at this whole story and like the universe had a plan, right? Because now not only are we serving so many kids nationally and helping them, but we're also scaling in Oakland. And this has gone from, work in Sabrina Kazi's classroom, which is just one classroom of, 25 kids, to several hundred kids in Oakland Unified that we're teaching to read today. And my hope is that over the coming years, it could be thousands of kids in Oakland Unified that we have the privilege to teach. And so from like one way that I think about raising the bar is not just like my own child, but thinking about what can be done to serve all kids equitably. I think about the growth we've had within Oakland Unified, but most importantly, I think about the way that even as we've scaled as a company to serve more and more kids, we are maniacally honing the quality of the outcomes that we are delivering for the precious kids that we have the privilege to serve. And what that looks like is all day, every day, I have teams of people in my company who are poring over student data and figuring out how do we keep pushing what we are doing to get even better outcomes for the kids that we're serving in this like short period of time that we have them. We don't have a guarantee that after one school year that child will still be at the school, still be in the district, still be able to participate in the program. And so it's like every single instructional second matters, which
Mhm.
means we have to constantly be honing everything we are doing about how we are teaching them and what we are learning about how we are teaching them and what our data is telling them in order to make sure that what we are delivering is nothing short of absolutely superb.
Right. And you guys are still like relatively new, right?
Mhm.
So I'm very excited to see like 10, 5 years, 10 years, what that data looks like. Because right now a big part of the work we do, right? I'm not sure how familiar you are, but we do a lot of just research on where students are at right now, right? So it's very similar to like the Right to Read film where they show you the data, right? And this year we actually just put out our report about a month ago that highlights, students reading at grade level, students
Mhm.
at the grade level, and then it also highlights A through G levels, like A through G completion rates as well for Black and Brown students.
Mhm.
And all, of course, but we really put an emphasis on our Black and Brown students who are, really in our reality doing the worst when it comes down to it right now.
Yeah.
Um, but when it comes to reading at grade level, off the top of my head, I might say it wrong, but when it comes down to it, it's like about 2 out of 10 Black and Latino students reading at grade level,
Yeah.
right? So I'm excited to see like with the work that you guys are doing right now, you know what the outcomes will be like in 5 years, right, or in a couple years, because of course we're not going to be able to see that impact in a year or not even in two, right? It's very very soon, but I'm very excited to see what that would look like down the road. And if has there been any kind of like data to show improvement so far? I know it's still early on though.
Yeah, really great question. So this school year that we're in right now was our first school year working with more than one or two schools in Oakland Unified. So one of our early adoption partners in OUSD was Korematsu Discovery Academy, and you're probably familiar with them. And a really interesting story about that school is that the year that we started working with them, they were slated to be closed at the end of that school year.
Mm,
And when I was talking to the principal, Principal Akuma, about partnership, what I really loved was that she said, I know my school is slated to be closed. And for this final year that we are open, I want to do everything possible to still make sure that I am giving my kids everything they need and deserve, including this reading intervention.
mm,
And I just admire and respect that so much. And so we got to work working with her kids. Now, her teachers also were rolling up their sleeves and, um, you know, leading core instruction and interventions. And then Ignite was an additional intervention on top of that for the kids who still needed that extra scoop. And the literacy data as measured by iReady, which is what the district uses, showed that her kids made significant growth in the program. And in fact, like overall, her achievement data in her school was so strong that like it didn't make sense to close the school, right? Like this is a school leader that is doing really great work and getting strong outcomes for kids. And so as we were then heading into this school year, Amy was like, I have to have Ignite Reading. Ignite Reading has to be here. We partnered again. We have even more kids we're serving, but simultaneously we began working with the district to do more pilots in other schools and began working with a handful of other schools, a few of which are in East Oakland as well. And very similar story, right? When we come in and we do our baseline diagnostics, what we see is that the majority of the kids we're working with are presenting with kindergarten skill gaps and beginning of first grade skill gaps. We're serving kids as old as fifth grade across our implementations. And what we're seeing in the data is that we are closing those gaps. We are moving them to fluency. We are more than doubling the rate at which they would be expected to learn absent this intervention. And then we are correlating these outcomes that we're seeing to assessments that they use, like iReady, or nationally normed assessments like DIBELS, in order to validate that growth. And the thing about learning to read, when you are taught to read the way that the brain is supposed to learn to read, meaning like, the English language is a code, kids need explicit direct instruction and lots of repetition to learn each piece of the code so that they can read increasingly complex words, sentences, paragraphs. Something happens in your brain called orthographic mapping. When you learn to read the right way and it is orthographically mapped to the brain, you can't unlearn that. So like, if you look at your screen right now, like you could glance at raising the bar and you're not even trying to read that logo, but your brain just automatically reads it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because like that code and those words have been orthographically mapped. So the way we're teaching kids is enabling this automaticity. And that means that they will then be able to apply that to read increasingly complex text. And there are studies out there that show the correlation between learning to read, especially in first grade when you're supposed to, and how that persists in third grade when the bar, literally, the bar has been raised and now you're also expected to comprehend.
Also, I feel like I'm learning a lot right now. Awesome. Well, I know we're wrapping up on time here, Jessica, but I do want to say just, one, thank you so much for your time. I definitely appreciate, you joining us. And like I said, I'm excited to really see what you guys are able to accomplish in a couple of years. Hopefully, you guys continue to, work with students here in Oakland, but also nationwide, because when it comes down to it, it is a skill that students need, to be able to do, anything that they want to do in the future, right? Like whether it's college or whatever it is, like students need to be able to know how to read.
Yes.
Right. So I definitely appreciate you and the work you guys are doing. And like I said, I'm excited to see, some of that data in a couple of years. I'm excited for it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Javier. It's been really awesome to be able to share this story with you and to talk about Oakland. And I'm so appreciative of the work that you all are doing to advocate for kids and engage parents. And some of your colleagues have come and they've seen Ignite Reading in action. So open invitation anytime you want to ride along with me.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, see adorable little kids learning to read. Yeah, let's make that happen.
For sure. Well, thank you so much, Jessica. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Peace.